Shalom everyone, Dr. Dinah here with Foundations in Torah, and I'm excited about another Torah portion here, Shemot, which means names. And this is basically the first few chapters of Exodus 1 through 5. Now there's a lot of information in these 5 chapters, and clearly don't have the ability to go into it in a lot of detail. Hopefully you've read the 5 chapters before we go through this. But I'm going to give you some sort of background foundational information to help you see the big picture. One of the problems we have is we get so focused in on a particular scripture or a particular concept that sometimes it's hard to see the bigger picture. And so I'm going to give you some tools here to help you see that, especially as you go through the book of Exodus, because it is really profound when you start to see the patterns, etc. What I'd like to begin is just to establish with you that the entire book of Exodus, and in particular the first bunch of chapters, we're going to see the creation pattern repeated. The creation pattern we have in Genesis 1 is actually repeated in the book of Exodus, starting with the very beginning. And so the focus, of course, of Exodus is on the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And this isn't really any different than what we have, the focus of creation. The focus of creation is building a house for the presence of God, which is the cosmos. The language of Genesis chapter 1 is architectural language of building and laying planks and setting cornerstones and things like that. And it's the exact same language we have in the book of Exodus. So Exodus is really a recapitulation of what it was in the beginning, to recap everything that was going into Genesis chapter 1. So in Genesis chapter 1, we begin with what some would call non-order, some call chaos, and from there things are established and the temple is built, a house is built. So in Shemot, in Exodus, we have the first few chapters dealing with all the plagues that come upon Egypt. So this is sort of chaos type language. And so a house is going to be molded and shaped out of chaos. And we're going to see how in the same way that creation was molded and shaped out of non-order or chaos. So just a couple of points here to keep in mind as we go through Exodus, Shemot. These are sort of points that bring us this big picture that I'm talking about. So I've talked about creation and temple building are synonymous terms. When you see creation, you see new creation. It's talking about building a house or building a temple. That the temple is the place that brings order out of chaos. And we'll see that with the building of the tabernacle, bringing order out of all the chaos that was in Egypt. The idea of that new life comes forth out of water on the 3rd day. When the seas are gathered and dry ground appears, we have sprouts coming up from the earth. And so this is the exact same picture we have of the children of Israel going through the sea. That a temple was always built on dry ground, dry land. Dry land signified that enemies had been defeated, and now it was good. They could build a house. Now, in the ancient world, of course, they built it for their gods, but Israel would build a house for her God, and so that he would dwell in the midst of them. This is the key to the entirety of Scripture, is that the reason God builds a house is he builds it for the place of his presence, so he can be in relationship, and so he can perform the things that need to be performed within that relationship. And so his initial house was the cosmos, but we can bring it all the way down to the actual building of the tabernacle, the first temple, the second temple, and then the body of Messiah. The 7th day always referred to the temple being finished, completed, inaugurated, and dedicated. So the 7th in Scripture, all the way through Scripture, has everything to do with house building. And that when a house was filled and completed, we sort of make the number 7, it's kind of abstract for us. And we just say, well, it's the number of completion, the number of perfection. Well, what on earth does that really mean? No, it's a number that means a house has been finished, that it has been inaugurated, as in the temple, the tabernacle being inaugurated and dedicated. It means that at that point, the king, who is the king, sits on the throne inside that temple and rules and reigns. It means chaos has been pushed back. It means all things have been restored and dedicated on the seventh. We see this every Shabbat. The Shabbat, the seventh, is a picture of the establishment of the house where God is ruling and reigning. And ultimately, when a house was finished, you didn't leave it empty, you filled it. And so the house was filled, the cosmos was filled, the tabernacle was filled, the temple was filled with the presence of God. That is key, that is the message, that's the number one message of the Bible. Now, there's a lot going on, as I mentioned, in this particular chapter. We have a list here of who came into Egypt with Jacob. Of course, the family went down to Egypt. It's always the idea of going down. Returning to the land is going up. The idea of going up to the mountain or up to the place where the temple was. And we find that there were 70, that's what it tells us, that went down to Egypt. Now, this is again significant because this has to do with house building, the number 70. So the idea was that the whole family, it wasn't part of the family in Canaan and part of the family down in Egypt, but that the whole family was reunited and together within the context of that family. Remember, they lived in the land of Goshen, that was great pasture land for their flocks. And they were fruitful, and they multiplied, and they filled the earth. Again, temple language, the seed coming together. 7 related to a completed house. Now, Joseph died, and all the tribal leaders eventually died. Through all that time, Israel was very fruitful, and so fruitful it was a fearful thing for the next Pharaoh who came to town, who was raised up. Now we have a new king, a new Pharaoh, and it tells us that he did not know Joseph. But it's not that he just didn't know who the guy was. It's that he did not recognize the authority given to Joseph to rule and reign over Egypt, which at that time was the world. That authority was given to him by God. So this new king clearly did not recognize the authority of God that was in Joseph. So that was gone. Now, Israel had become extremely numerous and powerful and a real threat. And so this Pharaoh figured in the time of war, they would join with the Pharaoh's enemies. They would fight against the Pharaoh and Egypt at the time, or they'd escape from the land. And then, of course, they wouldn't have anybody to do their servile work. And so because of this situation, the Pharaoh set taskmasters or slave masters over the people and afflicted them and oppressed them and etc. with forced labor. And so now they're forced to work, hard work in exile. And the more they were afflicted, the more they multiplied and spread until at some point the Egyptians made their lives bitter. And they were to work to build brick with mortar and bricks to build all sorts of great edifices and monuments to the Pharaoh. It's interesting because their work, if we go back to the garden, in the garden, Adam was the priest king, and he was to cultivate and guard the garden or the sacred space. The concept of cultivation and working in the garden had everything to do with agriculture. And so by nature, even as they left the garden, they were working in the area of shepherding. That was their work. The work of Israel was in agriculture, in raising and cultivating plants and trees, and also in shepherding. So now remember, they go to Goshen, and that's the place. That's got lush green pastures, and it's a great place to raise flocks. But now they've got to build buildings. And so we talked about, as the house in the ancient, the concept of the creation was a house building architecturally described as this house being built, the cosmos being built in architectural terms, laying stone, etc. But now they're laying brick. So it's, in essence, they are building a counterfeit house, a counterfeit temple to a Pharaoh who did not recognize the authority of God. And so now they're experiencing hard labor, and of course they're going to have to build these great monuments without their proper raw materials, and they were not allowed to have any straw. We see at the same time these two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and they're the ones that brought forth Moses. The idea was that the daughters could live, but the sons would be, the baby boys would be cast into the river. Of course, in the ancient world, a house, a dynasty, was always built through sons. And of course, the sons would be raised up to be kings. But of course, these Hebrew midwives the children, the mothers would deliver the children before the Hebrew midwives got there. But the two were responsible for the birth of Moses on the birthing stone. So Pharaoh, of course, ordered ordered his people to cast every son into the river, because that's how he would stop the dynasty and would stop the seed from spreading. He would stop it from producing and being fruitful. And really, this is what tyrants always do in every generation, to stop the seed of God from spreading to the four corners of the earth and being fruitful and multiplying. So the concept of killing the seed is what we have established here. And really, even in our modern culture, everything, it seems, focused on killing the seed that is of the believing community, to stop it from spreading, and basically to kill what we call the king line. So that's what tyrants do. Now it tells us that a man from the house of Levi took a wife. She was the daughter of Levi, so we know what tribe they are from. She hid Moses for 3 months in a teva. She hid him for 3 months and then put him in a teva, an ark, which is a papyrus reed. Now we say it's a basket. This thing was coated with tar and pitch. We have a big problem here, which I'll address in just a second, because we all have seen too many Cecil B. DeMille movies, and this little, by the banks of the Nile River, this tiny little basket, and this baby's in the basket, floating down the Nile River, and nothing could be further from the truth. Now, there's this baby in this thing, and the daughter of Pharaoh comes, and she's bathing, and she sees the baby. Her sister is called, and Miriam gets the mother, Yocheved, to come to nurse the baby. And the daughter of Pharaoh names him Moshe, which means I drew him out of water. And let me just set the stage for this is kind of immersion, mikvah type imagery. So when Yeshua is raised up out of the water, Luke chapter 3, for example, at his immersion, and God said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." This is coronation language. It is language in the ancient Near East world that he's been raised up to be king. When the God was ruling said, "This is my beloved Son," that is language, again, of coronation. And the Son of God was a title for the king, and this is true in almost all of the ancient cultures. So this is the same thing we have here with Moses. And so, although I'm pretty sure it didn't look exactly like this, I'm trying to give you a different visual, not a basket. So they would, because the Nile River was the place where their God ruled from, it was the most important thing in the ancient Egyptian world. And so this was the place of the gods. And so they would build these large boats out of the papyrus reed, and on these big boats, they would have an inner chamber. I don't know if it looked like that, but just to give you the visual. And in the inner chamber represented the inner chamber of a temple. These boats were like temples. And so this is where the gods dwell. The gods dwell on these boats in this inner chamber. And so when she saw that, she would recognize that Moses was a god who had been raised up out of the Nile River, who was raised up to be king. A whole different view of this particular picture. She assumes he is like a god. And as we move on, we have the story of Moses seeing the Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He kills the Egyptian, hides him, and then later goes back out, sees two Hebrew guys fighting with one another. And he asks, why are you beating your companion? And the other guy says, who made you ruler and judge over us? So in our mind, we read that and go, well, who made you judge and king? I mean, that's exactly how we think of it. But he is stating a fact that Moses had been raised up to be the ruler and judge over the Hebrew people and really over all of the land of Egypt as well. And so, he responds, are you going to kill me as well, like you killed the Egyptian? Pharaoh got wind of it, tried to kill Moses, and Moses got out of Dodge and headed to the land of Midian, actually, and he fled there to a well. We have a water thing going on. And it was at the well he sees what? 7 daughters of the priest of Midian, Yitro. And they had also come to draw water, and he rescued them because it says that the shepherds drove them away. Now in ancient Mesopotamia, shepherds were rulers. So we got rulership, kingship stuff happening here. And again, we have 7 daughters, house building language. So a new house was going to be built, if you will, through the 7 daughters. Of course, the one daughter chosen for Moses, Zipporah. Moses saved the girls and he watered their flocks, and he told them that an Egyptian, they recognized that an Egyptian, because that's how they saw Moses, as an Egyptian, had rescued them out of the hands of the rulers or shepherds who had lorded it over them probably plenty of times when they went down to draw water. Again, Moses was given Zipporah to be his bride, and she gave birth to a son named Gershon. And it basically means a foreigner, saying that I have been an outsider in a foreign land, which is really the whole story of Moses' life, because even in Egypt, he's a ruler in a foreign land, and now he comes out to Midian, and he is considered a foreigner. In time, the king of Egypt died, and things got really bad for Israel, and it is said that they groaned in their slavery. Now, this all is in Exodus chapter 3. Moses then begins to tend the flocks, returns to shepherding type work, not building monuments, and he is tending the flock of Yitro, the priest of Midian. And it says that he led the flock to the end of the wilderness to the mountain of God at Horeb. Now, mountains in Scripture are always referring to temple type things. It's their houses. What they are the connecting places between heaven and earth. And so he's been led out to this place where heaven and earth meet, is where a temple would be erected. And it was the place that connected those 2 spheres. And so he is out to the mountain of God in Horeb. Here he hears from God that God has seen the affliction of Israel. He's heard the cries of the people. He recognizes that these slave taskmasters are oppressing them and afflicting them. And he understands and knows the pain and the distress. And he tells Moses to tell Pharaoh in time, I am who I am has sent me to you. And I think it's very interesting here, and I never noticed it actually until I was preparing for this particular teaching, but it says in there, gather the elders of Israel together. Now that didn't make any sense to me, because consider that where was everybody? They were in Egypt. It appears that the only one that left Egypt was Moses. So who are these elders? Are they elders, original elders? Let me back up, because on a mountain you have 3 spheres, and the top of the mountain was the place of the inner chamber, like we saw with the boat. And in the inner chamber is coming into the presence of the god or the king. Halfway down the mountain is where the elders, which we call the garden area, where the elders served and cultivated the garden. And at the bottom of the mountain would be the outer courts where all the people were. So is it something related to the family of coming down from Jacob, or are these elders related to Yitro? It's pretty unclear, but it's in there that the idea of gathering elders. Elders always worked. Elders and priests worked in the temple. That was key. And Goes on to tell us that they'll bring him out of the affliction. He'll stretch out his hand and strike Egypt with wonders. Basically, he will remove, through all of this chaotic activity, he will move Israel out of the land to a place where they would rebuild the house. And so all of this will be going on in the next bunch of chapters. So we see this vision now that Moses has of this tree that's on fire, burning, but it's not being consumed. And I think most of us just sort of think, well, there's the mountain and here's the flocks down below, and then kind of over here is the tree. But in the ancient world, trees were very important. Trees were always trees always grew from the top of the mountain. Again, the mountain was the connecting point between heaven and earth, and the tree of life, or what they call the axis mundi, or the tree of the world, is what joined heaven and earth. It was an axis that joined heaven and earth. Trees in the ancient world were key because they were the connecting point, once again, like a temple between heaven and earth. So this tree was likely on top of the mountain because the top of the mountain represented the Holy of Holies. So if we consider that the tree probably was a picture of the tree of life, and the tree of life in the temple, by the time we get to the first temple, would have been the menorah. Of course, in there we had 10 trees, but the menorah represented the tree of life. It represented a tree that was forever burning. Of course, the priests would go into the holy place of the first temple and serve in that place and light the menorah, but the menorah was to be on fire, lit, the lampstand lit all the time. It's a perpetual fire. And so this is likely what is being communicated here, that he is coming to this place where this tree, this represented the holy oracle of God, where God is going to speak from the inner chamber. The bush is burning, not consumed, and God promises that he is going, from the oracle, to communicate to Moses. God has promised that he will deliver them, and he will bring them out and back into a land flowing with milk and honey. And he would bring a sign to Moses that he promised he would do it, he would be with him, and that they would worship God on this mountain. Again, the idea of worshiping on a mountain has to do with the temple, that they would worship in the place of the presence of God in the temple. Again, we have this repetition of, you will take the elders to the king of Egypt. So we got these elders somewhere that are going to go with Moses and Aaron to Egypt, those that serve the king, would serve in the temple, etc. And they're going to ask to take a 3-day journey into the wilderness in order to leave Egypt. And just a mention again about the menorah. It was a tree of life, called in the ancient world the axis mundi, the connecting point between heaven and earth. Every ancient culture had a tree of life. A tree of life always would grow up from the mountain and stretch out and cover the whole earth with its canopy. This is very common imagery. We see also that the sign that God is going to give Moses, the staff that Moses has, is going to become a serpent, and then when he grabs it again, it's going to turn back into a staff. So that was one of the signs. And he would grab it by the tail and turn it back. And I don't really have time to go into all of this, the serpent language. It has more to do with authority and rulership and dominion over the sphere in which the serpent had dominion and rulership over. It was taking rulership, it was taking authority over that sphere. God told Moses if they don't listen to the first voice or the first sign, they'll listen to the next one. And of course, he sticks his hand inside and it pulls it out, and it's sa'arat, leprous, and then he puts it back in, and it's not. And these were the signs. And again, I don't really have time to go into that right now. But this concept of the authority over the serpent, the ruler of this world, who was at that time Pharaoh. So the serpent came to represent rulers of the Gentile empires all through the scriptures. Again, we talked about taking control over the river. The river turns to blood. This has to do with the river god, pouring it out on dry land. Again, language of building a house, temple building. temple building was designed to remove the chaos, and there was great chaos about to come on the land of Egypt through all of the 10 plagues. Again, the water becoming blood, etc. So all of this is all through the language of Exodus 1 through 5. Now, Moses at one point asked Yitro if he could go return to his kinsmen, and he has his wife. They set out in the donkey. We have the story here of Zipporah taking the flint, circumcising her son, calling him a bloody bridegroom. They go off to Egypt. Again, we have the staff sovereignty thing. And Pharaoh's very clear about the plagues and slaying the firstborn and all of this language. I want to encourage you to read the whole story once again. But again, I want to emphasize here the mountain, the concept of the mountain being the temple, the place where you would go to build the house. And Exodus moves into Exodus chapter 4. The people God had remembered Bnei Israel. He's seen their affliction, and he was going to deliver them out of chaos. And he was going to take them through the water as a birth. As they were a nation growing inside another nation, they would be birthed out through the canal, the birth canal, which was the Yom Suf, the Reed Sea. And at that point, Pharaoh's armies were destroyed, and the Pharaoh returns to the deep, which represents the throne of the enemies. The throne of the enemy was in the deep. The throne of God was on the mountain. This is all ancient Near East language. We're trying to get back to the context of what these things mean and not insert our own modern day opinions into what's going on. But it's essential that you begin to understand this type of language. And so when you start reading the scriptures, it's going to make a whole lot more sense. And I know there are multiple levels going on, but there is imagery that was very common to their world, and it is very much a part of the Bible since it's an ancient Near East book. And so hopefully these tools will help you see and understand this type of language. And of course, Pharaoh and Aaron go before the Pharaoh, let my people go so that they may hold a feast for me in the wilderness and take a 3-day journey to sacrifice to Adonai. And God clearly says, now you will see what I am going to do. And of course, Pharaoh responds as, who am I that I should listen to your voice, to the voice of God, and let the people go, the people that make my empire powerful. And it goes on from there. Anyways, I hope, I don't have any more time here, but hopefully these themes and these concepts will help you understand, and you can go back and reread it and see this in a whole different light. So thanks for joining me. I will see you next time. Shalom.